All right. Today we're going to welcome Brittany Friedman back to the Systemic Podcast. Brittany, thank you for joining us again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And today we're going to talk about your new book, Carceral Apartheid, which will be coming out in January of 2025. Which, depending on this, will probably be released around the same time. And so, I wanna dive right in, and first start with when we say carceral apartheid. I know many people think, well, apartheid is over. That was South Africa. This is a thing that's not even connected. Why are we talking about apartheid specifically in 2025? But also, what do you mean by carceral apartheid?
So I think what's important to note is that that is one of the lies that I talk about in my book, is that apartheid never ended. It is a
Mm-hmm.
through line, meaning it's ongoing. And so I call carceral apartheid a system of governance that uses social control such as mass incarceration, policing, in addition to the extra legal controls that Black people in particular and Indigenous people and Latinx people know very well, such
Mm-hmm.
as police officer lying, torture, disappearances, setups, and corruption. And so these systems, one that is deemed legitimate by the law and the other that is considered extra legal, are working to maintain white supremacy and racial hierarchy. And this is why I call it carceral apartheid, because this system really runs on creating division, both
Mm-hmm.
inside prisons and outside in society.
No, and I appreciate the definition. And it's one of those, because you're right, it is the lie that apartheid died, and is no longer a thing. But I think and it's something that you talk about in the book as well, as sort of this through line when we think about colonialism and the early racism and enslavement that happens, and how, oh, well, you're now emancipated, and that transforms and morphs into the Jim Crow era, and it transforms and morphs into the prison system. And so this notion that it's never really over for minorities, specifically Black people, and what you're talking about in your book, in that it's just morphing. It's the people in power are still in power and are still doing these things. They're just finding new ways to do it. And one of the things that really, really stands out in the book is that it's almost this parallel that I want you to talk about between what's happening outside the prison system and what's happening in the prison system at the same time, because it's the same notion of, well, we have police lying and creating the situations that many Black people are being arrested for, and then they're being thrown in the prison. But what's happening inside is almost that exact same setup. So whether you're free on the outside, free in air quotes, or you're imprisoned, you're still dealing with the exact same system. Can you speak to that?
Absolutely. And I appreciate your close read. I feel like, Dan, you absolutely understand this work and what I was trying to show, and that it is a very real consequence of the systems that we have on the outside, where police are corrupt, where they're creating
Mm-hmm.
setups, creating situations where there's division between neighborhoods. For example, in Los Angeles, there was a longstanding tradition of allowing white civilians to run into Black and Latinx neighborhoods and basically act like the Ku Klux Klan. So they would
Mm-hmm.
create violence, and then people of color would be arrested for these incidents for defending themselves. And so we see
Mm-hmm.
this happening in the prison system. And what I talk about in carceral apartheid is how correctional officers who are coming from this outside world, bringing this system with them as a means of controlling people that don't look like them and
Mm-hmm.
recreating it on the inside.
And it's that very, and the recreation is the part that I think really gets me, is that because reading through and in my own study of UEP Newton and the Black Panthers and what happened to them while they were in prison and on the outside, I always sort of saw this very surface parallel. But your book really dives into the notion that no, this is the exact same setup. And I love that you bring it up, but I hate that it happened. It's this very circular model that in the book, you speak specifically to the idea that deviants are mainly Black people who tend to speak up against the system, and the notion that Black militants become this really big focus, but the idea that Black militants come into existence to stand up to white supremacy. And so on the outside, you become militant and you're standing up and speaking for yourself and saying, I deserve to be here. Well, that gets you arrested and put in the prison system, where if you do the exact same thing, now we're going to put you in solitary confinement or something worse. And so that you almost have this notion that there is no escape. There is no way out of this, because standing up for yourself at this point in time, outside or inside, you're going to get in trouble. Can you speak to that?
Yes. And so the reason that people adopt this notion, specifically, for example, people who are members of the Black Guerrilla Family or Black Panther Party or Nation of Islam, in particular, self identifying as a Black militant is so powerful because they are actively deciding to live free or die trying. And that's why I name a section of the book that
Hmm.
quote, because that's what it was explicitly said to me, right? And that's a phrase we all know well, live free or die trying. But for them, it was an active reality behind bars with correctional officers literally aligning themselves with Nazis that would then become the Aryan Brotherhood. And so, in that scenario, what is your choice? Are you going to
Hmm.
die on your knees, as one person told me in an interview? Or are you going to organize yourselves? Are you going to educate yourselves on the Black militants before you and the Black
Hmm.
militants currently, right, in your midst and in society? And then are you going to join up? It's a
Right.
question one has to ask themselves. And I think that it's quite powerful, this process of really having an unbelievable decision. You know, right? How many
Hmm.
of us can imagine having this decision where you have to decide, am I going to allow this system to destroy me, or am I going to stand up and fight? And I think it's interesting that if you ask people of color these questions, people that have survived what I would consider to be American genocides, right, of indigenous
Hmm.
people, of Black people, um, I think that we would say as a people, yes, we choose to fight, right? We
Hmm.
need, as someone said in the book very clearly, what is important is that we have a militant mouthpiece.
Yeah. And I appreciate you saying that the idea that it's almost anyone in American society has suffered through this that's essentially not a white person, in the notion that whether you're indigenous, you're Latinx, you're African American, Black, or African who's come here, that there's this line that we all sort of understand that it is this sort of live free or die trying, because it's a struggle the entire time. And the opening of the book, you share stories of visiting the South and learning and hearing the stories from your grandmother, about sharecropping and all these things. And the thing that stood out, which hooked me immediately, is the universality of it, because it is personally your story. But my mother tells me the exact same story of getting home from school and filling up the bag that's supposed to have watermelons in it, cotton in it, with watermelons in the bottom, so she could get home and could do her homework fast, so that she could get that done very quickly. Or going on road trips to Alabama and hearing her tell stories of how her grandfather would point out different things that were happening on the sides of the roads in the past, and this and that, and that while we grew up in different areas, we have different parents, different grandparents, there is this weird universality in African Americans in this country, whether it's in the prison system that you sort of show as well, but even in just the stories that we tell, that we've all sort of been through all of these things. Can you talk to that a little bit as well? Like, just the notion that even though I wasn't in prison and went through these things, I do understand sort of the notion that cops will lie on you to get you arrested, and that it's a universal thing that we all understand, almost a language that we speak.
Carceral apartheid is systemic. And because
Hmm.
it is systemic in its efforts to destroy us as a people, as a community of color, right? As a community that has been
Hmm.
labeled undesirable and then able to be eradicated by these weapons of violence that I talk about in carceral apartheid, it's going to create a shared sense of collective identity, right? It's going to
Hmm.
create cultures of solidarity around facts. And the facts are that the police will lie on you for their own
Hmm.
means, for their own, it's sometimes it's for their own joy. It's not just for their own advancement, which is what I try to also show in carceral apartheid, is that there are
Hmm.
times when correctional officers are behaving in ways where you can tell that they are enjoying themselves and that it's not
Yeah.
simply about money or what you would think is bringing in drugs, right, for the Aryan Brotherhood. It's also about this collective degradation and desire to inflict pain on people that don't look like you and people that you wish did not exist, and find solidarity behind that. And so then you have
Yeah.
two cultures of solidarity forming, right? You have one that is forming around this sense of superiority and a shared joy in eradicating Black people. And then you have this other culture of solidarity that is forming around this idea that we are people, that we are human beings, we are men, right? We are women, we
Hmm.
are children, we are people that deserve to live, and we will take our place in this society if you don't give it to us.
And I appreciate that as well. And you said at the beginning that the notion that there are undesirable people and these things. Can you speak to, and you talk about it in the book, how in a white supremacist society that notion of what is considered undesirable is almost an after effect, aftermath. It's not like people were undesirable at the beginning. Something happened and we decided, well, if we make you undesirable, we can make laws around that. Can you speak to that some more?
Yes. And so this effort, and it's a campaign, right? It's a
Mm-hmm.
propaganda to make people believe that white supremacy is real. So white
Mm-hmm.
supremacy is the first lie that we are often taught as children in this society.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very powerful if you can make people believe, right? Fanon speaks about this in terms of how colonization is also a social psychological process of
Yeah.
degradation of the mind, right? Of trying to force people to adopt this sense of inferiority. And it starts very young as children. And that's why I
Mm-hmm.
opened Carceral Apartheid with the prologue of talking about being a child and witnessing my father be humiliated at a gas station, and
Mm-hmm.
trying to understand why. And then I'm starting to understand, even though I'm a child, I can tell that it's about race, and it's about us being other, and it's about us
Mm-hmm.
not belonging there, and feeling a lot of shame that we should not be there, and feeling very afraid. But also I think the key here, right, is racism seeks to inflict shame around inferiority, and it's all a
Mm-hmm.
lie, right? It's all a lie. And so I start with that to show, to your earlier point, that carceral apartheid is systemic in its efforts. And then as a result, we all, as Black people, have these shared experiences, a shared language of how to talk about these experiences, and can
Yes.
understand what is happening, and can often intuit what is happening right before it happens, right? It
Mm-hmm.
creates almost like a psychic ability to foretell when something is about to happen, and it's because
Mm-hmm.
our
Mm-hmm.
senses are so heightened to the effects, because the effects are not just in the present moment. As I try
Mm-hmm.
to show with my grandmother, and as you spoke about, right, about your mother, and Anthony in the book, right? In the book,
Mm-hmm.
Anthony
Mm-hmm.
speaks about his family. It's intergenerational. So it,
Yeah.
it does create this ancestral effect where you can perceive what is happening right before it's about to happen. And you can see it in the book with the founders of the
Mm-hmm.
Black Guerrilla family. They knew they were next. They had
Yeah.
concrete proof, but they also had intuitive ancestral proof that this is what is going to happen to us if we do not organize ourselves.
And I love that there's one of the chapters you begin with the quote from Malcolm X that if it's not worth dying for, remove freedom from your vocabulary, and this notion that all of these leaders they knew that their end was coming, that to stand up was the thing to do, but it would probably be their end. Can you speak to what kind of courage that takes to want to be a leader? You're already in prison and suffering as well, but to organize yourself in a way that you're going to stand up for your people. Can you speak to what that learning about that was like?
I mean, what it was like for me to learn about that through the interviews,
Mhm.
just to
Yeah, yeah.
clarify.
Mhm.
So so hearing in the interviews, I would always get chills. I would get
Mhm.
chills in the interviews because I it would literally act as a portal. I use this word in I
Mhm.
believe it's the chapter where I'm talking to Andrew, that it's
Yep, yep.
even though we're sitting on the porch, it's like
Mhm.
there's a portal that has been created that has like taken us back into that place. And it's because like
Yeah.
he's going back into that place as he's talking
Mhm.
and as he's moving. And I was happy he was moving. And a lot of people in my interviews and conversations with them are moving as they're talking about this time period, and talking about this need to not only it's to defend oneself and right to protect yourself on a physical level, but it was
Yeah.
also a reclamation of the soul for many people in the way that they talked about it. And that's why I use this metaphor of dark and light, because people described it as this like vampiric effort to annihilate them on every level of what it means to be a human being. So it's your
Yeah.
physical body is under attack, your mind is under attack, but it felt like their soul was under attack. Like it's like, we're going to disappear you, and no one knows
Hmm.
and no one will believe you. And that's why it was so important for the Department of Corrections in their secret correspondence that I uncovered. They use words like, it would not be in our best interest to create martyrs, right? Like they
Yeah.
explicitly say, we do not want to
Hmm.
create martyrs. And
Hmm.
these are the types of backroom conversations that, if we have access to, we can prove that
Hmm.
racism, right, is it's an intention. It is
Yeah.
not like a consequential thing that is happening where it's like an unintended consequence. It is
Yeah.
intentional. And so yeah, I would often get chills. It would be like a portal getting transported into that time, and then I have to close the space, because I work in ceremony and like in
Hmm.
healing and in different traditions. And so I'm like, we have to close this portal in this space because it's powerful, but it at times would feel very dark. So we have to
Yeah.
close it.
And Andrew's story is one that really does speak out in that you're sort of getting the opposite and trying to understand how someone can be so vitriolic while they're in prison. And I think it comes after the part where you talk about the idea of white above all, and this notion that you have prisoners who ideally that's where you think people would link up, is that we're all inmates, but race sort of trumps that. And that if I'm a white inmate, I had better align myself with the guards because that's where power lies. And so your interview with Andrew is one that really sort of sticks out in that it's almost this flip side of understanding how do you allow that to happen to yourself. Can you talk a little bit more about that interview?
Yes. And so Andrew was a very interesting interview, because when I first met him, he was actually quite shy. And I talk about
Hmm.
this in Carceral Apartheid about how he's kind of withdrawn a little bit in the beginning, even leading up to when we were sitting down. He was way more withdrawn than I had expected. And then I realized it was because he was ashamed of his tattoos. And I
Hmm.
describe in the chapter how he starts to cover his hands a bit because they are covered in these very, dark swastikas that I could tell were prison tattoos.
Hmm.
And the rest of his arms were covered. And I could tell by his appearance, right? He has like some silver in his hair. He's like in his 60s. And you were sitting there, and I just did my best to make eye contact when he was speaking as a sign to show him, like, you are a human being. To me, you are a human
Hmm.
being. I am sitting here, we're opening this space. I'm not sitting here thinking I'm about to interview Andrew and he's a white supremacist and he used to be a very pretty high ranking member in the Aryan Warriors, and he likely killed people to get to that position. I never sit down with that prescription in my mind. I always sit down
Hmm.
and I think, okay, I'm about to talk to a new person. Let's open this space. And when I sat down with him, and I started to employ those techniques of humanization versus
Hmm.
dehumanization, he started to open up. He stopped covering his hands. He started talking
Hmm.
to me and telling me about how he grew up in Chicago. He grew up in a neighborhood filled with other working class families of color that were Puerto Rican, that
Hmm.
were black, that were he was like there's a lot of Irish people, there's a lot of, German descended people, but he's like, we were all working class and I played with everyone. And
Yeah.
so for him, he was also taking me back through his own journey of like, wow, I really grew up like that. And then I ended up like this, with covered in swastikas, believing in white power, believing in white above all. And what's important about his journey is that it was correctional officer orchestrated, right? It's not just Andrew going into prison and he's this terrible racist. No, he
Right.
goes into prison. He is coerced into becoming a white supremacist because he sees the consequences of what happens when you don't. And I'm sure that in that section on, for example, the person Ronald, what happened to
Hmm.
him, I am curious what you thought about that. That was very difficult, honestly, to write about what Andrew witnessed. When someone breaks the rules of white above all,
Yeah.
and how officers are a big part of allowing things to happen to people.
Well, and I think that for me, that it was one of those, it cements the idea that there really is this notion of a supremacy mindset in power, and the notion that we have to go through and really institute this and hold people accountable in this very wrong way, but hold people accountable to the notion that we're in power and that we have to keep these structures in place. And regardless of whether or not you want to be different or you don't want to join us, you don't have a choice. And that, because Ronald was the one, I believe, who was from Milwaukee or Minnesota, who grew up in an all black neighborhood, had the black mannerisms and everything. And so that and it's a very weird notion. I grew up in a very diverse area where my high school, white and black are the two lowest populations, where it was Hispanic and Asian. And so like the idea that you have to fit into a specific group is somewhat foreign, because we were all different. So that was the group that we were in. But the notion that you're in this institutional system that says, no, 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 you must pick one. And if you don't pick the one that we want you to pick, you will be dealt with regardless of who you are. Because here's a white man who says, well, I just want to be independent. I don't want to join anyone, and still gets in trouble. But you're white. And it's that notion of, no, 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 white isn't so much a race as it is a rank. And that if you're going to do this, you've got to be a part of it this way to survive. And so it was very interesting to read that A, he had to witness that, but B, that was what was still happening in this notion of, we'll turn on ourselves if you don't want to join us.
Yes, absolutely. It was, that's why I included his story, even though it was told to me by Andrew as someone who witnessed it,
Mm-hmm.
right? He's a witness, so I can include it. And I almost didn't, because of the graphic nature of the story, and
Yeah.
your listeners will see that when they get the book. But I also felt like it was important to show that, like,
Mm-hmm.
this is actually how far the institution will go to make sure that people who are white that are incarcerated will believe that white above all is the law of the land, no matter what.
Yeah.
This is how far they will go for their own, against their own, to
Mm-hmm.
punish them, to show
Yeah.
that white above all is the law and that you don't break it. And Andrew never forgot that. It was clearly just fully ingrained into his psyche and into his body. Because even when he was
Yeah.
telling it, I mean, of course, to see something like that is a significantly traumatic experience. But to have a traumatic experience be matched with the notion that white is on top, putting those
Yeah.
together creates a profound social psychological impact on someone. And the same can
Mm-hmm.
be said for the opposite, right? Having a
Yep.
significantly traumatic experience be paired with this idea that you are black and you are nothing. Putting them
Mm-hmm.
together has a profound social psychological impact that stays with someone, that stays
Mm-hmm.
with them as they go through their incarceration, but stays with them on the outside. And that's why
Yeah.
for me, I believe that when you're doing this type of work, it is most important that this is a work of care. You
Mm-hmm.
don't go into these conversations thinking, oh, I'm going to go here and I'm going to investigate, right? Like, you have your investigative ideas of what you want to understand. But at the same
Mm-hmm.
time, it's about, for me, it's really just about seeing the humanity in someone else, and they see the
Yeah.
humanity in me. And whatever comes up in our conversation is what comes up. And that's how I
Mm-hmm.
went through doing the research for this book. And the more that people opened up, and the more time I spent in archives, I was like, oh my gosh, everyone is saying the same thing in different
Yeah.
ways. And that's, in sociological speak, we call that triangulation. But in like everyday speak, we're like, if everyone is saying the same thing, then where's the lie? And then for
Right.
me, I'm like,
Right.
oh, the lie is the Department of Corrections. That's the lie. Everyone said it in a different way. in a different way.
Right. That's yeah, and that's what's amazing is especially what is it in '94 when we finally learned the truth about the war on drugs and that they just flat out are like, no, we lied. Like everything we did was a complete setup. And so you're right, like it's the Department of Corrections of the lie. But before we go down that road, I want to go back. Can you talk a little bit more about your process? And so you doing the research, finding these individuals, and getting people to trust you as a sociologist, as a researcher. Can you talk about that because there is a lot of you. Like the book starts with you in these stories, and it switches to your stories, but then it switches into talking about everyone else's stories, but your presence is always there. The one, I forgot the man's name, but you talk about, you got there in the early morning and it was moonrise before you left, but you sat and you ate dinner and you were sort of in communion with his family while he's talking to you. How do you get to a point where you're getting this level of trust? Where does that come from within you? And sort of talk about that process.
For me, doing research is first and foremost about humanity. It's about
Mm-hmm.
understanding people. And so, if we're going to understand people as a sociologist, as a person, and also as someone who I also work in the healing arts, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm trained as an herbalist and as a healer and intuitive in those ways. And that's something I also bring with me ancestrally. So I
Mm-hmm.
think that having that blend, being someone that is multidimensional in how I see myself and how I introduce myself, it doesn't come with the same weight and baggage and fear. I think if another researcher just goes in and they're like, I'm going into this space and I'm going to extract knowledge. It's like
Mm-hmm.
that's never how I ever approach anybody in life. And then I'm like, if you're doing research, why would you approach someone like that in research too? Like it's a person.
Yeah.
So like, it's a person. So
Yeah.
for me, the first step is always I do a lot of reading
Mm-hmm.
to just to understand what has been said. That's when I first realized like, oh, this is all BS. Like there's a lot of BS about the Black Gorilla family and like George Jackson and Aryan Brotherhood and how the officers keeps being seen as like the heroes. I'm like, no, this is like, okay, I can spot a lie. No, no. So that's how I started. I started reading. I'm like, no. So what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to start, some of the people's books I read, I'm like, I'll reach out to the author and see, when you were doing your research, did you meet anyone that I should talk to that might talk to me?
Mm-hmm.
Did you come across any collections? And so I talk about it in Carceral Apartheid in the beginning and then a lot at the end in the methods section where
Mm-hmm.
I reached out to people and they made some introductions, but that's all they
Mm-hmm.
could do. They could just say, I can introduce you to someone. I don't know if they're going to talk to you or not. Or like when I was
Right.
in this particular archive, I saw a collection that might be of use to you. So you should go see. But like it's basically about following leads. So I'm like, okay, these are
Mm-hmm.
all these information. I will go and I'll just try and see what happens. And I'll never forget the day where I first had my first contact and conversation with Anthony. Because for
Mm-hmm.
me, Anthony was just like, was such a powerful relationship that began when I was a student. Because I started all of
Mm-hmm.
this work when I was a student. Um, and he was introduced to me by another researcher who was like, she's a student, she's doing this work, she's interested in your story, would be related, can you talk to her? And so I
Yeah.
remember I spoke to him on the phone. He called me and I'm on the phone and I was like, I'm like a student and I'm like, oh my gosh, talking to him. And we start talking and he just asked me so many questions about myself, my
Mm-hmm.
intention, but really just wanted to have a conversation. And I think
Yeah.
that I was blessed in that our conversation was just a normal conversation. It wasn't like
Mm-hmm.
a it wasn't like a researcher subject and I'm just like diving into and being weird. I consider it being weird. I tell my students don't be like that. Right? Talk to somebody that you would want to be talked to. Don't be weird. Don't be like a robot.
Gotcha.
Because they
I
try
love
to
it.
train us to be like robots in graduate
Mm-hmm.
school, and I'm like, no, I've explicitly written against this, like in terms of how to do research. But um, so we have a real conversation. I feel like we really connect, and he's like, okay, he's like, you're a cool kid. Like that's basically what he said. He's like, you're a cool kid. Like I can tell you
You
sound
passed the
young.
vibe check.
Yeah, he's like called me a kid. He's like, you're a kid. I know he's an elder. So like I also
Right.
respond with sir, because that's how I was raised. So
Yep.
and
Yep. Yep.
he's like, I'll keep talking to you then. Sure, I'll give you a call again. Like, let me know when you're free. So we just
Hmm.
start talking on the phone. And over time, enough trust is built from these conversations that he's like, okay, you can record me now. And I'm like, really?
Gotcha.
He's like, yeah, you can record me. So then I have my little recorder and we're
Hmm.
talking and having conversations. And I'm just kind of like still surprised that like this person who I know who he is and he knows that I know who he is, that he's letting me record him. And then he goes, you know what? I think my family wants to meet you. I've been telling them about what our conversations and what you're doing. And I think you should come and we should meet. And I'm like, okay, like I have to talk to my family, and I think, if all is well, like I can, sure, I'll come. That would be, for me, that was the best case scenario, that one day we could meet in person and we could talk in
Hmm.
person. And he's like,
That's amazing.
yep, sounds good, come and bring your recorder. That's what he said, bring your recorder, I have a lot to say, it's going to be a long time, you're not going to be able to take
Wow.
notes. Yeah, and so that's really how it happened with Anthony. And then Anthony started
Hmm.
introducing me to so many people, because little did I know, until several conversations later, that Anthony was actually a leader. I didn't know that at the time when he was active in the organization as a co-founder, he was a leader. I didn't know that.
Okay.
I just, because I he the other researcher, to their credit, right, to protect his confidentiality and privacy, didn't introduce him to me that way. All he said
Okay.
was, "This is Anthony. He did a lot of organizing in the prison movement when he was incarcerated. You should talk to him." So it was like this like process of like, so in my mind I'm like, "Oh, he was there. He was there with George Jackson. He
Hmm.
was like there." So I that's who I think he is, which it is who he
Okay.
is. But then in
Right.
the
Right.
conversations over time is when he just like drops it in one conversation, like, "Oh, I co-founded the organization." And I'm like, what? Like, you did?
You're like, oh wait, I'm talking to who now?
Yes. And he's like, well, how do you think I would know all of this? Like, how would I know all of these things if I didn't co-found the organization? And
Wow.
and I come to find out, because as a researcher, it's our job, right? We triangulate, or we make sure everybody's
Hmm.
saying the same thing. So I never drop Anthony's name, because this is,
Hmm.
research ethics 101. And also because I was, as a kid, I was taught as a kid, I know how to talk to people without dropping people's names and things like that, which suits me well as a researcher. But when I had other
Yeah.
conversations with people, they would bring him up, and when they would bring him up, I'd say, "Oh, okay." And they'd say, "Yeah, he was like a leader." And I'd be like, "Hmm, okay, sure.
Checks
Thanks
out.
for telling
Checks
me.
out.
Thanks for letting me know." That's all I would say. Thanks for letting me know. But in my head, I'm like, okay, everybody keeps calling him that. And then I started noticing that like there was a lot of deference, toward him, in terms
Hmm.
of people wouldn't talk to me. Like if someone, people would, the first thing they would say to me was, "I'm talking to you because Anthony said you were cool." And that's when I started to
Wow.
realize, like, as a sociologist, in terms of like the culture of a group, I was like, oh, he
Hmm.
definitely is the leader. Like culturally,
Yeah.
I can tell, because everybody's waiting. They're not saying much until Anthony's like green light. So I was very fortunate that, the kid I was at the time, when I had that first phone conversation with him, that I just talked to him like a person. I just talked to him
Yeah.
and I didn't really know who he was. So
That's
yeah.
amazing. That is very amazing. I love also that, like, still to this day, while he's not the leader, that there were still people who were like, well, until Anthony gives me the green light, I'll talk to you, but I'm not going to actually talk to you, and that he was able to vouch for you in that manner. And so that's really awesome that you sort of got to experience that and didn't know who he was going into it, and sort of it checks out each time you talk to someone else. Nope, he wasn't lying; he's telling the truth. And so that's amazing. So thank you for sharing that. I want to sort of pivot back to the book a little bit and talk about there's a lot of the book deals with the sort of the notion of what the government or the guards or the Aryan Brotherhood, all these people are doing at different points in time. Can you speak to the amount of energy that was spent on suppressing Black militants, to me, to the point that like I can't write a letter to my mom without somebody going through it and determining that this one line might lead to maybe this, can you speak to like just the amount of energy that the US government and the prison system really spent on trying to suppress this group?
The US prison system, the federal government, the state government in cahoots with the federal government, and the correctional department, they spent almost every waking day thinking of how are we going to suppress Black militants? How are we going to get them to fight each other? How are we going to prevent them from organizing other incarcerated people around this notion that we are all prisoners or we are all inmates, right? How are they going to build
Mm-hmm.
cross racial solidarity if we keep instigating fights between them and
Yeah.
Latinx people, between white people? And so they spent almost every waking day in some form or fashion, right? Every day,
Yeah.
trying to do this, whether it be through official means that I described, such as labeling people as a Black militant officially in their file, which would allow them to be disappeared into the adjustment center, which the
Mm-hmm.
adjustment center is infamous in the writings of Black militants. And I have a whole chapter.
Yeah.
So chapter 2 is on the
Mm-hmm.
history of the adjustment center, because to my knowledge, there's not a an overall succinct archival based history of the adjustment center, just
Okay.
outlining from beginning to end how they started it and its inner workings. And so that's why I wrote that chapter, is because when I came across that collection in the archive, I was like, this is going to be a contribution to history, right? Not just
Mm-hmm.
sociology. So I need to write this up. Even though sociologists were like, this is a very long-winded chapter. And I'm like, yes, but there's not a
But it
history. There's
does.
not a history of the adjustment center book.
Yeah.
I tried to find it as a student. And I was like, and then when I came across the collection in the archive, I was like, I have to write this up.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
And it does well because, especially being at that second chapter, because it really, as the book continues, it gives you that frame of reference of when someone says, oh, well, because the one thing one says, I got sent to segregation or I got sent to the adjustment center, like you understood the gravity of what that meant. And then the notion that you were still being tortured even more. And so I appreciate that you put that chapter there, that you really give that out there.
Thank you. I felt like I had to do it, because it's like, it's not like, oh, I'm going to be the first to write this history. No, it was like, we need this because there are so
Mm-hmm.
many people sitting in Pelican Bay right now in California, which is the
Yes.
supermax prison, who started off in the adjustment center, in a prison, in segregation, because of being validated as being a member of whatever Black militant group. And
Yeah.
the gravity of that, right, as you stated, you wouldn't understand as a reader what someone is saying when they say, oh, I, and they're writing a letter and saying, I am in the adjustment center. It's like the adjustment
Right.
center was the epitome of hell. It was
Yeah.
exactly, it's the best representation, I think, to really show what I mean when I say that the Department of Corrections was seeking to destroy people physically, mentally, and psychically, is
Mm-hmm.
really seen in the adjustment center, and that it was very officially orchestrated, meaning it's formal policy. It's not some
Mm-hmm.
officer going behind the scenes and lying and creating a fight. No, this is like coming from Sacramento. And that's why I use their own words to show it's coming
Yes.
from Sacramento. Prison officials are thinking this through. It's very much emulating and embodying the eugenics movement, the longstanding
Mm-hmm.
eugenics in terms of using solitary, using treatments, which are
Right.
synonymous with what we saw right in Nazi Germany. It's like
Mm-hmm.
you all of
Mm-hmm.
these different types of procedures are being done, and it's being done on our people. In the same way, when you look at the history of chattel slavery on the outside, all of these very common medical, innovations that we celebrate now, many of them came from these very eugenics based
Hmm.
sadistic torture of people who were enslaved. And that's what I try to
Yeah.
show in this book, that that is what was happening. And that is a foundation of carceral apartheid, not just on the outside, but in prisons. And it's happening at the same time. So that chapter, as long as it is and as wordy as it is, it's like you have to read it. And I had to write it, even though it was
Yeah.
very hard to write. I wanted to write in a more storytelling voice and talk about my interviews, but I was like, I can't do that because you won't understand the gravity of this interview unless you
Hmm.
understand where that person was put for months and months, if not years.
No, I agree 100%. And I mentioned earlier that for me, the introduction to a lot of this was an early reading of Revolutionary Suicide, and one of the things that stands out, and that there's a connection between your book and Huey P. Newton's autobiography, is how for him it was the mental gymnastics of staying sane, because he at least knew that because of his position on the outside, they couldn't keep him in forever. There'd be this repeat of him being thrown back in, but like that was that initial notion of, okay, so it is bad because like he's having to literally go through these mental gymnastics to keep himself sane enough to get back out and move people forward. But if you don't have that strength, or you've literally been locked up for a petty crime 10 years ago, and now you're in a life sentence and you're being thrown in this is, like you said, it's hell. And the notion that they're putting glass and feces and your food and mixing it in, or that you're letting white supremacists yell these things to you and keep you up all night. It's a system that's designed, as you say, to break you down and degrade you. For the people that you spoke to, not a mental state so much, but how do you feel that, for them, how are they holding up today after surviving so much of this degradation and sort of dehumanization?
I think that it's a spectrum. I
Hmm.
think that having survived that, right, having lived that, having fought against it, and then having been punished for it for fighting against
Hmm.
it, right? I think that in the present day, people receive a lot of love and support from their friends and family because they need it, right? They need to
Hmm.
be upheld after years of being broken down. But I think it is a spectrum because I think that, people have good days and they have bad days. There are days, I think, when it just weighs on the person, on the psyche, and on the soul.
Yeah.
I recently had a conversation, now that the book is coming out January 7th. I spoke to Anthony recently, and we just had a conversation, and he was like, like kind of like poking fun at me at, like, it's like over 10 years later and you were that like young, like, student at Northwestern, and like it was just great to speak to him. But and see him just like smile, and he's like full of life. And
Hmm.
it's because I know that, like, some days he has days that are not good, right? And
Yeah.
it's because this is not history for him, right?
Right.
Carceral Apartheid it isn't a history book. It's a
Hmm.
book that is weaving together history and the present moment and making a case
Yeah.
for why this can't be our future.
Right.
And when
And
I
go ahead.
oh, just that,
Hmm.
it's one of the big things that he wanted to talk to me about, because we hadn't spoken in a while, was about Huey. Excuse me, about
Hmm.
Hugo. Sorry. One of the
Okay. Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
one of the big things that that Anthony wanted to talk to me about was Hugo and his murder.
Hmm.
And the impact that had. Because it's like you see that and it's like that's 2015, right? It's like that's 2015, and he's just and it's not over. And
Yeah.
it's still happening. And I think that it's not just triggering, but it can create almost like a sense of defeat. But that's
Hmm.
why I say it's a spectrum, because I think that there's bad days, but there's good days where, you're never going to stop Anthony. You're never going to stop Benjamin in the book. You're not going to stop people.
Yeah.
Like, even Andrew, right? Who we would say in the book, he's on the other side of the war, but the war that is orchestrated by the Department of Corrections, right?
Hmm.
And so Andrew being on the outside, he told me explicitly, he's like, I do work now. I work in nonprofit work. I volunteer my time, and I work with other men who were incarcerated of all racial groups, all organizations, and we're all working around issues of mass incarceration. And for me, like he told me that that has been very healing for him, because he has found community around the notion of we were all incarcerated, and
Yeah.
he has found himself again without this white supremacist overlaid identity that came from the
Hmm.
Department of Correction. Now he feels like himself again because he's on the outside, and so there is redemption and joy in that.
Hmm.
And having and so I that's why I really say it's a spectrum. You know, it's
Yeah.
people are still finding their joy, and they still and I also I truly believe that some of the most kindest, joyful people are people that have literally survived hell on earth.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that, specifically about Andrew, and the notion that like he, who he was, wasn't his fault while he was in the prison system, and that now that he's out, he's finding his own sort of peace and ways of rectifying that, and realizing, no, we were all incarcerated. It wasn't you were incarcerated and I was with them. That was all of us together, and I was manipulated. And I appreciate you sharing that, but that's part of that journey for him as well, because you're right, he does deserve redemption. Like he was there too. It sucks that he was a pawn, but he was there too. And your conclusion is about this idea of storytelling and the power of getting these stories out there, and that there's truth in the story, and that you could have done research and not talked to Anthony and talked to these other people, but when we're reading this, we're getting the story right from the individuals who were there at that point in time. Can you speak a little bit more about the power of storytelling, and what the call of this book is? What is it you want people, when they're done reading Carceral Apartheid, what should be their action steps, or where should their mind be going?
When people finish reading Carceral Apartheid, I want them to feel in their heart that there is a call to dream of a different world. That
Hmm.
the old world, which is based on the illusion of freedom, and it's
Right.
actually a desire to control fate, is fading away if we let it. Right? It's
Hmm.
still trying to maintain a stronghold. If we look closely, like at politics, if we look
Hmm.
closely at the division that we see on a global scale, it's still trying to maintain a stronghold. However, there is a new world being built every day. Every day, people are not just surviving, they're thriving. They're trying to
Hmm.
build community. They're trying to prioritize love, human connection, nature, right? Joy, and ultimately heal all of this degradation and division that carceral apartheid has wrought on us for centuries. And
Hmm.
that's what I want people to take away. I want them to feel like once they finish this book, it is an invitation to
Yeah.
awaken to another world that is possible, and that we don't have to survive this every generation. Every generation
Yeah.
doesn't have to keep surviving and having their version of carceral
Hmm.
apartheid, their version of the story. Because that's what I
Yeah.
try to show. It's like every generation has their version of this, and it keeps
Hmm.
morphing. But we don't have to do that anymore.
Yeah.
And we shouldn't.
No, I appreciate that, and that's one of the things that really does speak out in the book, is that it is this weird cyclical process. In my own research, I'm looking at towns that were destroyed in the U.S., and there's a story that really stands out about. I think it's in Cincinnati. There's an Irish population that moves in, and they're given this ultimatum: you're either white or you're black. Because before they had moved there, they were Irish, and it was one of these notions that you needed to choose. And it sucks, but for their safety, they realized that they needed to choose to be white, which meant that they were anti-black and helping to, expel people from these towns. And so that it is this very cyclical process, because what happens to them in that town is what happens to Anthony in the prison system, where it's like, all right, well, you're here, you've got to choose on these dividing lines. You can't just be yourself. You can't just be a working class individual. You need to decide. And so I love that the call is that we don't have to hold on to that anymore, that we're at a point in our time that we can move forward and literally just let go of the past and find a new path forward. And so I appreciate that that's the call that's in this. In a in looking at the world today, and mind you, this interview is being recorded before the election, so we have no clue what's going to happen in a week. But how do you feel that what your research has shown, and how white supremacy and the apartheid system that's sort of held the world at siege, how do you see it sort of acting out as of right now, and what are your hopes that how do we move forward, I guess, is really what I'm asking.
Thank you. Well, I think that what we see very clearly, and what I talk about in the introduction, is that carceral apartheid is not just domestic, right? It's
Hmm.
global. That there's an
Hmm.
interconnection between militarization abroad and militarization at home against populations that our government, because it is white supremacist and elitist, has
Hmm.
labeled as undesirable. And thus, if
Right.
you label a population as undesirable and you use all of these different dehumanizing terms, it's much easier to eradicate them. Even eradicate them in broad daylight when it's streaming live on Twitter. And I think that's
Right.
what we see in terms of what's happening in Palestine right now. I think it's very
Hmm.
clear. I think that it's very clear in this book in terms of how Black militants were actively writing letters to the outside about what they were surviving, right? So we cannot say that in 1965 no one knew. It's the
Right.
same thing in terms of what we're seeing in the Middle East. Like, no one can ever
Hmm.
say, I didn't know. It's the same
Right.
thing that's happening in terms of the Congo and Sudan.
Hmm.
No one can say, I didn't know. And that is why this book ends with this invitation to awaken. It's like that very famous song. It's like, wake up, right? Wake up.
Yeah.
I think, doesn't Spike Lee say it too at the end of the what? Which
Yep. It's
yes,
school days. Lawrence Fishburne, wake up. Yeah.
it's like that's what I want to do is just yell like wake up. And I try to say it very nicely at the end of the book, like it's an invitation. It's an invitation, right? Because
I
I
love that.
very much I believe in
I love
freedom.
it.
I do. I believe in freedom. So I don't believe in trying to coerce you to wake up. It's an invitation to wake up. Because if
I
I
love that
invite
so much.
you to wake up, then we're
Hmm.
actually going to change the underlying energy of division and chaos and control. If I try to coerce you to wake up and believe what I believe, then I will be reproducing the very same system that I described in all of the chapters before. And that's
That's
why I
powerful.
title it an invitation, because I
That is
just am
very
extending.
powerful. Yeah. And I love that view of it as well, because I think in today's world, when we look at systemic racism, we look at efforts for inclusion and diversity, and you're right, we've been yelling for so long, and it's maybe it's time to say it's an invitation. Come with us on this journey, as opposed to you need to go on this journey. And so I really do appreciate that. And you're right, it's very global. I love that in the book that there's this US timeline, but when you turn the page, there's the global timeline. And that this notion that while what we're talking about is the US prison system and what's happening here, that this is a very global phenomenon, and that if you turn on the news on any channel, you can see this exact same thing where you've got state actors designating groups as undesirable and then using all their resources to go after them. And it's happening on every landmass across the country, across the world. And so I appreciate that you don't shy away from that in your research and talking about it, and that you sort of set the stage of this is a bigger thing than just the US. I'm focusing here, but understand you can take this and apply it somewhere else. And so I appreciate that as well. What have I missed in the book? What have I not gone over? What do you want people to really sort of know, or something that I overlooked or anything?
One thing I
Because I
would
don't want to
just
give it
say,
all away.
no, I have really appreciated our conversation, and I wanted to pick up again on this idea of right of the invitation and
Hmm.
shifting fate. And the reason is because, I believe that we can invite people into conversations. But I
Hmm.
do also believe, right? I That's why I have these quotes from from Malcolm X and the different quotes that I quote, throughout the book.
Hmm.
It's like, but I also believe in standing up for yourself. And I
Yeah.
believe in boundaries. And I
Hmm.
believe in, what my grandmother taught me. And I lead with her right in the opening because my
Yeah.
grandmother was a badass. Like she had her she was like she was armed because of the Klan
Hmm.
in Missouri, and
Hmm.
she was like, this is my right. I'm a Black woman. I defend myself. They won't ever come onto my land, and I
Yeah.
won't go out with a fight. And so
Yeah.
like that's how she raised us. And I feel like it's such a privilege to have a grandmother who was born in 1914. And I was like, I'm a millennial. So all of my friends are like, how's your grandma that old? I'm like, my grandma is like, she's aged. She's timeless. And so I
Right.
learned a lot of things from her, right? I learned about the healing power of different modalities of the land, which is why that's very important
Hmm.
to me. And I include that in how I do my work, not just in academia, but in every day. But also my grandmother taught me to fight. And my grandpa
Hmm.
too. My grandfather was a boxer before he started working as a foreman. So I believe in balance. So it's like I will
Right.
invite you to this conversation, but don't play with me. And that's how I
I
feel
love
about
it.
it. If you don't want to come and sit at the table, then turn and go. But don't try
Yeah.
to go across my invitation and confuse my niceness for weakness, because it's
Mm.
not. It's just, I'm just basically trying to show that we're both equal and there doesn't need to be a show of force today. And that's how I
Yeah.
live, that's how I live my life. It's like if you want to choose a way, go your way and I'm going mine. And that's why I
Yeah.
believe in freedom. I believe that people have a right to choose their destiny. And
Yeah.
that is what has been denied from indigenous people in this country, black people in this country, and Latinx people. And it's what is continuing to be denied from people that we are watching right now in Africa and the Middle East, in terms of they are being denied the right to choose their destiny as well.
Yeah. Well, Brittany, I appreciate this time today. I appreciate this book, Carceral Apartheid. For my listeners, I will, when this is alive, I will make sure that I link to where you can purchase it online. Please read the book and do some research and understand that there is a different path forward. We don't have to keep living this nightmare, and that we can move through this. Your research is inspiring. Brittany, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Dan. I really appreciate it. And please go out and get the book wherever you get your books. And you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Curly Professor.